This video is all about the Module 4 of English Language Testing and Assessment. The qualities of effective assessment systems. The last module looked at the steps that developers can take to embed continuous improvement within their assessment procedures. This module examines in more detail the qualities of a good system of assessment, the characteristics that users look for when choosing assessments or that educators look for when evaluating an assessment system. In other words, the characteristics that make the assessment useful. 4 qualities of useful assessment: beneficial consequences, validity, reliability, practicality. The 4 elements represented in Figure 4.1 represent a broad but by no means universal consensus on the essential qualities that make up useful language assessment systems. I would not wish to downplay the importance of other qualities that have been proposed, such as authenticity, Bachman and Palmer 1996, or absence of bias, Conan 2004, which are discussed in Module 7, but I would argue that they are reasonably well accounted for within this 4-quality framework. Presenting the 4 qualities in Figure 4.1 in the form of a cone with practicality at the base, beneficial consequence at the top is intended to convey something about the relationship between them. Practicality is found at the base because it is a necessary condition for all assessment. An impractical assessment will simply not survive for very long whatever its other distinction. Beneficial consequences that might flow from use of language assessment are the apex of the cone because they are ultimate objective of any assessment system. This hope for consequence may include reaching and learning becoming more effective, opportunities opening for language learners, and employers finding suitably qualified staff to carry out linguistically demanding tasks. Their position in Figure 4.1 reflects that they are supported by the other qualities. Beneficial consequences are not guaranteed by the presence of the other 3 qualities, but are very unlikely to follow if an assessment system lacks practicality, reliability, and validity. Movement of the cone also represents increasing controversy. Judging the practicality of an assessment system is relatively straightforward matter. Its validity and consequences will be much more often disputed. Practicality. Practicality was described by Bachman and Palmer 2010 as the difference between the resources that will be required in the development and use of an assessment and the resources that will be available for these activities. It is self-evident that an assessment that lacks resources will not be suitable if there is not enough time, equipment, money, or expertise to operate in an assessment. It may never be used and certainly will not survive in use for very long. In reality, assessment is always in competition for resources. In any language teaching organization, informal assessment in the classroom has to compete for time and attention with other day-to-day activities. While at the more formal, summative end of the continuum, assessment has to compare for funding with libraries, computers, software, teacher salaries, and all other essential requirements of a functioning school, college, or national education system, where quality assessment is made a priority. Resources can often be found to support it. Practicality can be thought about in terms of efficiency, the extent to which the commitment of resources to a system of assessment is justified by the benefits it brings. As in other areas of expenditure, assessment choices involve a complex balancing of benefits and costs. As we are 1993 put it, we have to be sure that tasks we are using are the most efficient way of obtaining the information we need. Equally, it is important to ensure that all of the activities involved in an assessment, including development, scoring, giving feedback, reporting results, and monitoring quality are taken into account and that they are carried out as efficiently as possible. Educational managers need to weigh up the gains from investing in assessment against the other demands of their budgets. Teachers need to think about how much of the limited time they have with their students should be spent on assessment and how best integrate and balance with these other activities. Assessment systems cannot and should not continue to be used unless benefits of maintaining them outweigh the cost. Task 4.1 The place of assessment in the classroom. Add your own ideas to this list of the language teacher responsibilities. Keeping administrative records, planning lessons, being accessible and caring towards students, effective classroom management, assessing student progress and achievement. Professional development, developing knowledge of the language, developing knowledge of teaching principles and techniques, making topics interesting and engaging for students. Put the responsibilities in order of importance. Where does assessment appear on your list? How does assessment support or conflict with the other responsibilities? It is not easy to find the right balance. Teachers may enthusiastically pick up new ideas only to find that they cannot keep up with the additional workload, or they may resist new forms of assessment because they worry that new system might involve extra tasks that cannot fit into their already busy schedules. Often managers underestimate the amount of time and commitment of resources required to support good quality systems and so fail to invest enough. Alternatively, they might overestimate the cost, conclude that they are prohibitive, and fail to invest at all. Many assessment projects fail because planning only allows for the cost of development and not the substantial additional resources needed to keep the system going. It can be difficult to persuade managers and policymakers that it is not enough just to be seen to have a test or assessment in place. That it is vital that it should also be used as a basis for making informed decisions about assessments. Making it useful will mean allowing for the ongoing costs involved in maintaining, supporting, and improving it. As with other areas of policy, good qualities assessment often relies on energetic individuals who are prepared to argue for funding, demonstrate the value of good practice, criticize bad practice, and recognize what is and is not achievable in their working context. Table 4.1 suggests a list of illustrative practical issues that many constrain an assessment development and therefore need to be taken into account. Bachman and Palmer 2010, Brown 2005, Bach 2009. These are organized in relation to the rules identified in Module 2. Judgment about how best allocate resources usually bring with them disagreements and political controversies. In addition to what calls resources constraints of the kind presented in Table 4.1, Bach 2009 observes that there are often additional system constraints imposed by the established working practice in cultural issues. In some places, performance is traditionally reported in terms of percentage, while in others, teachers tend to use letter grades. Certain approaches to assessment in certain item formats are favored in some countries but rejected in others. Multiple choice questions and standards examination are well established in Turkey, for example, but are seen as controversial in the Russian Federation, where assessment by teachers are using performance assessment and is the tradition. It will generally be less continuous to go along with local expectation than to try to take a different direction. Task 4.2 System Constraints. Think about a place where you have taught or learned a language. What do learners there expect assessment to be like? What kinds of tasks do they expect to see on national tests? What kinds of assessment do they expect from teachers? How are scores on tests usually reported as ABC grades, as percentage, as verbal descriptions? What score or grade to learn usually have to get to pass a test or course? Are grading policies decided nationally by the school, by individual teachers? Advances in computer technology have made some techniques such as controlling and timing the delivery of assessments more practical. They have opened up opportunities to capture more kinds of data, such as how long each assessee takes to respond to each item. However, different software platforms also impose their own limitations. It will not be possible to deliver ideas for innovative task formats if the software lacks the functionality, and some techniques are actually easier to manage on paper. Problems with software or with logistics of delivery material to large number of assesses by computer have put an expected end to many otherwise promising projects. While it is not possible for any assessment to be reliable, valid, or beneficial if it is not sufficiently practical to get off the ground, it is quite possible to have a practical assessment, one that is administratively manageable, that has very little to recommend in it in terms of other qualities. In fact, such as assessments are also common. As Baker 1989 rather cynically expressed it in relation to end-of-year examination, all that is necessary is that the exam be difficult or traumatic and have some vague relationship to the course of learners have followed. Very often in situations where assessments are used, no information is ever collected that would allow users to tell whether they have any of the qualities that might make them useful. It seems to be enough that students answer questions and that grades or score are awarded, even nobody can explain what this might actually mean. Reliability. We use various tools every day to measure aspects of the world around us. Clocks to measure time, scale for weight, thermometer for temperature, and so on. When we use them, we want to know what we can interpret these tools consistently. If the time on your watch was sometimes the same as the clocks on the wall and sometimes very different, or if your scale told you that 1 liter of water weight 500 grams in the morning, 2 kilograms in the afternoon, you would reasonably conclude that they were faulty and would not trust what they told you. Of course, many of the tools we do use every day are not very accurate, but they are good enough for our purposes. We generally get to meetings on time. We measure out ingredients in cooked food, a suitable temperature. Much more precise tools are available. But there is trade-off between precision and cost. Accuracy is expensive. Most people don't mind arriving a little early or late for a meeting and barely notice if the temperature in the room is 1 or 2 degrees warmer or cooler than is displayed on the thermometer. Measurement of time, temperature, or weight involve tangible quantities that most people do not find controversial. Language ability is a much more slippery and less certain concept. In most approaches to language assessment, it is assumed that language abilities represent a kind of mental trait or attribute. Similar to physical traits such as height or weight, we can often describe people as having more or less language ability in rather the same way as we describe them as being tall or short. Anyone comparing fluent speaker with learners just beginning to grapple with the language may have little difficulty in accepting this idea. On the other hand, all language learners know that they are better at coping with some situation than others. Those who have studied a language as an academic subject to a high level often struggle to communicate when they first travel to a country where that language is spoken. Those who learn a language in the country becoming fluent through the interaction with different neighbors may have more difficulty with formal written language. In these circumstances, it is more difficult to judge who has the greater language ability. For this reason, it may make more sense to conceive of many different kinds of language ability depending on the social purpose for which the language will be used. The development of assessment of languages for business or for medical or academic or other specific purposes reflects this point of view. In any case, it has to be acknowledged that we are simply not in a position to measure language abilities with the same precision that we can achieve for weight or temperature. Even their very best language assessment cannot come close to the consistency and accuracy of watches or skills. It is unbeatable that the estimation of language abilities will involve sustainability and certainty of measurement error. The best we can do is to estimate the impact of this upon the score we obtain, and there are established statistical tools that allow us to do just that. Regrettably, users of assessment results often fail to understand the implication of measurement error. They often overlook or ignore it. If student A has scored 60 points on a language test and student B has scored 52, users may assume that this is concentrate evidence that the student A has a greater ability than student B. As this section will illustrate, however, this is not necessarily a reasonable assumption at all. There are several potential resources of measurement error, and each affects the degree of confidence we can place in the accuracy of results. These sources of error include measurement using different tools, measurement of different occasions, measurement of different groups of assessors, and measurement by different individuals. If they have reasonable estimates of the amount of error and understand how to interpret this information, users can gain a sense of how accurate scores and grades might be as indication of the assessor's abilities. Without this information, they can only guess. Measurement using different tools, consistency. Just as some tape measurement or scale are more accurate than others, there can be little doubt that language assessment can also be more or less accurate. Also, unlike tape measures, assessments are usually more accurate along a certain limited stretch of the range of ability than at points above or below this. It is as thought a tape measure could gauge distances between 40 and 60 centimeters. Quit precisely 56.3 centimeter, 48.1 centimeter, but could only provide fuzzy estimates of about 25 centimeter or 30 centimeter, or at least 80 centimeter for distances outside this range. A complicating factor is that we have no independable yardsticks to help us judge how accurate our language assessments are. If our watches show different times, we can check them against a world clock on the internet. If our weighting scales disagree, we can use a standard weight to check which is accurate. Sadly, there is no generally accepted gold standard measure of language ability. When they measure exactly the same qualities, we can translate results between different measurement scales by applying a simple calculation. Kilograms to pounds in weight, Fahrenheit to Celsius, and temperature. In contrast to weight or temperature, the concept of the language ability itself is understood in rather different ways by individual teachers or test developers. According to their beliefs and intention, teachers may use different assessment methods in different combinations to measure abilities and arrive at grades. Translating from one perspective to another may not always be possible, and this causes obvious difficulties for the users of assessment results. Content sampling. Even where two assessments are intended to measure the same knowledge, skill, or abilities, are built to exactly the same specification, are administered to the same people at the same time. In other words, where two forms of the same assessment are combined, there will be differences in the results. This is because each form can only deal with a very limited selection of the language to be assessed, and it is a matter of chance how far the sample that is chosen matches each learner's limited knowledge. To illustrate sampling issues, let's say a teacher gives Class A group of 20 students an informal test or guess or quiz based on 1,000 words they are supposed to have learned. To check whether the student know the words, leaving aside the tricky question of the what it actually means to know a word. He could give them a quiz made up of 1,000 questions. 1 point is available for each correct response. If all the students perform to the best of their ability and manage to stay awake. This quiz would show the teacher exactly which of the words each student knows, but it would also take too much time, and mindful of the need for practicality and efficiency, he might decide that a quick 10-item quiz based on a random selection of the words should be enough to tell him which student now know most of the words and which do not. Task point 3. How many points would you think a student who knows 50% of the words should score? What do you think the teacher should conclude about a student who gets just 2 points on this quiz? How about one who scores 6? In fact, although the teacher does not know this, each student has learned a random selection of exactly half of the words. In this scenario, taking the quiz is rather like asking each student in the class to flip a coin 10 times, as each student effectively has a 50% chance of knowing each of the words on the quiz. Task 4.4. Heads and tails. Try flipping or spinning a coin 10 times. Count how many times the coin lands showing one face heads, and how often it lands showing the other face tails. Count each heads as 1 point and tails as a 0. What was your total score? As all the students know 50% of the words, you might expect most of them to get 5 questions right out of the 10. But if you flip your coin 10 times, it's not particularly like that you give 5 heads. Only about 25% or 1 in 4 people get this result. Most people, 66% or 2/3, will find they get 4, 5 or 6 heads. So for most of Class A, the score of 4, 5 or 6 do wrongly reflect that they know about half of the words, according to the laws of probability. However, there is a good chance that 1 or 2 students might score 7 points and 1 or 2 might score 3 points. There is also a good chance that at least 1 could be very lucky or very unlucky. In the sample of words on the quiz, there is about a 4% chance, just less than 1 in 20, that a student who knows just 500 of the 1,000 words would actually score 8 out of 10, and a similar chance that 1 would score 2 out of 10. It would not be astonishing if 1 scored 10 or 0. Now let's imagine the teachers gives the same quiz to a second group of 20 students, Class B, but in this group, each student only knows 250 of the words based on probability. Each student in this class has roughly a 25% chance of success on each question. So we should expect just over half, 53% or 11 of the students, to score either 2 or 3. On the other hand, we could expect 4 or 5 students to get a score of at least 4 out of 10, and there is a fair chance that 1 student might be able to score 6 or more. If the teacher decides to recognize his classes on the basis of this quiz, placing those scoring 3 or below into a lower level, those scoring 4 above into a higher level class, we would expect to see around 7 of the 40 students going into wrong class. Even if we increase the distance in the probability of success in the different groups, let's say that in Class A, the students all know 750 words, there are still likely to be learners in Class B who will perform at least as well on the quiz as the lower scorer in the Class A plus, simply because of the choice of the word on the quiz. Happily for the teacher, there are ways to improve reliability. One is to increase the number of questions. Of course, 1,000 questions would make the picture very clear, but even 100 questions would be enough to minimize the possibility that members of Class A might be confused with members of Class B. It is unlikely but not impossible that anybody in Class A would score less or anybody in Class B would score more than 35 out of 100. On the other hand, taking a representative sample of the full range of language abilities is usually a much more complex proposition than than the one facing this teacher. Even when every effort is made to maximize quality, precision is very difficult, time-consuming, and costly to achieve. Measurement on different occasions. Stability. A problem when trying to measure people's physical characteristics like height, weight, and foot size is that this can fluctuate significantly. By late evening, people may be as much as 2 centimeters shorter than when they wake up in the morning. Mental abilities will also fluctuate, being affected by the time of the day and physical conditions. Performance on tasks of all kinds is affected by alertness, health, and mood. This means that even if we were able to administer identical and perfectly accurate language assessment on different occasions, without learners recalling the answer they gave the first time around, we would still see differences in the learners' scores on each occasion. And it's not only people's abilities that change over time. If we don't very carefully control the conditions on each occasion that we administer an assessment, the experience may be inconsistent. Uncomfortable heat and traffic noise might make the afternoon's listening session more difficult than the mornings, when it was cool and quiet. If the teacher of class K always allows her student 10 minutes longer to complete their writing assessment than was allowed for students in class J, they may produce better work, even though they have the same level of ability in writing. Holding conditions constant can help to make results more reliable, but it can also be very limiting. Using only strictly controlled tasks for assessment in class can rule out the use of more creative, unpredictable task types and restrict the role of the teacher to that of an invigilator, prevented from taking formative opportunities to investigate students' difficulties or to help them learn from and improve on their performance. In reality, when tasks are used by teachers, they will be inevitably be a good deal of variability in conditions. Balancing the negative effects on reliability from this variation over the course of a few weeks or months, teachers generally have numerous chances to observe what a student can do. This means what they gather far more evidence of students' abilities than would be available from most tests. It has been argued that this broad sample of unassessed abilities may offset the limited reliability of the individual assessment tasks made by teachers. Black and William, 2006. Measurement of different individuals' characteristics. Differences in performance over time are closely related to the personal attributes of assessors. What Bachman and Palmer 2010 called assessee characteristics. They were divided by Sullivan and Green 2011 into the 3 categories: physical, psychological, and experimental. Physical, psychological characteristics include, along with short-term illness and injuries, long-term disabilities that might impact upon test performance, such as poor eyesight causing difficulties in reading the test materials, and stable biological characteristics such as gender. Psychological characteristics will also include relatively short-term issues such as concentration and mood, together with more stable characteristics such as personality type. These characteristics can play a major part in performance on assessments. For example, some individuals suffer from such debilitating anxiety when taking tests that they may be unable to participate, while others seem to respond very positively to rest conditions. Every effort should be made to put assessors at their ease so that they are all able to perform to the best of their ability. Characteristic of assessors: physical, psychological, and experimental. Physical or Physiological is short-term illness, injury, age, long-term disability, gender. And the psychological, unpredictable, short-term. Concentration, emotional response, motivation, memory, resources, cognitive style, personality, systematic, long-term. Experimental, examination, preparedness, examination, experience, communication, experience, the outcome to residents, topic knowledge, knowledge of the world, education, language, background. And table 4.2, the experimental characteristic include language background. The speaker of different languages encounter different kinds of difficulty when learning a target language. And educational experiences such as experience of learning languages or previous practice with a certain type of assessment. General knowledge is also likely to contribute to performance. Knowing something about the topic of a recording might help an assessee to perform well on a listening test. Learners with little experience of using a language for communication may struggle to respond to a self-assessment questionnaire based on real words language use. For example, assessors will find it much easier to respond yes or no to a statement on a self-assessment questionnaire such as I can make a complaint about simple matters, for example, the light in my room does not work. Association of Language Testers in Europe 2002, if they have experience of a similar situation, contrasting groups of assessors, mean men and women, adults and children may have different amounts and different kinds of knowledge about the world. Differences between assessors affect estimates of the reliability of measurement. When assessments are administered to more homogeneous groups, they produce more reliable results. When different populations of the assessors are involved with different areas of strength or weakness, it is not so straightforward to rank them and results tend to be less consistent. In an assessment that includes the use of articles in English, a and the, for example, if all the test takers are speakers of French or Spanish languages that have article systems, the results are likely to be more consistent than if the French and Spanish test takers are joined by speakers of Turkish and Russian, speakers of the language that do examiners to score it on a scale of 1 to 100 as thought it had been written for the prestigious Indian Civil Service examination. He received 28 responses. The number of scores awarded at the different levels is shown in figure 4.2. Two examiners thought that the composition worthy of the full 100 marks, but one scored it as low as 45 and three others also gave it a spelling score or less 70. Edgeworth 1890 concluded that I find the element of the chance in this public examination to be such that only a fraction from a bird to two-thirds of successful candidates can be regarded as a quit safe above the danger of coming out unsuccessful if a different set of equally competent judges happen to be appointed. You might like to try a similar experiment to discover whether the situation has improved since 1890. Task 4.5. Find a copy of a foreign language writing task and text written by a student in response to the task. You might use one from your own teaching context or from a testing organization's website. Give these materials to as many teachers or trainees as you can. Ask each teacher to read the text independently and give it a score out of 100, with 60 as the passing score. Have the teachers each write their score without disclosing it to anyone else and give it to you. Prepare a bar chart like figure 4.2 showing the number of teachers awarding grades each level. Were your results similar to Edgeworth? If the results were better, more consistent, why do you think that happened? Happily, it is possible to train waiters to become more consistent. This is usually done through an Standardization sessions. In a typical standardization session for an interview test, a group of aspiring raters is shown several video recordings exemplifying different score levels and covering the full range of the rating scale. The raters who look at previously rated interviews discuss the rating scales and criteria with the developers and try to adjust their own interpretation of the scale until they feel they can consistently match the predetermined official scores. The trainees are then asked to work independently to rate more recordings of interviews. Their ratings are compared with the official scores for these interviews. If the new raters consistently agree with the official scores, they are allowed to work as a raters on the assessment. If they do not achieve consistent agreement, they are either given further 7 ways to build reliability into assessment design. The following suggestions are based on Hughes 2003, Brown 2005, and Douglas 2010. Number 1. Make tasks clear and ambiguous. If the assessment is well laid out and clearly explained so that assessors can all see exactly what they need to do, there is a better chance that their performance will actually reflect the intended language abilities. If instructions are not clear to everyone, that is not a problem, but with the assessment, which needs to be improved. Number 2. Add more tasks or more assessments. If you ask one a question, a weak assessee may get lucky and give a correct answer. If you ask more questions, look will be less of a factor and a consistent picture of the assessor's abilities is more likely to emerge. The more often you observe a student during a course, the more likely it is that you will get a reasonable sense of where his or her strengths and weaknesses lie. Number 3. Limit the scope of what you assess. A grammar test with only one format will be more reliable than a test involving a range of language skills and abilities with multiple formats. However, this will also limit what can we learn about the assessor's abilities. Number 4. Standardize the condition. The results will be more consistent if the conditions are the same for everyone, although there are maybe good arguments in favor of offering choices to assessors or giving some assessors more time than others. Such variation in condition will reduce reliability. Number 5. Control how the assessment is scored. Providing clear and comprehensive answer keys, unambiguous rating scales, and training for scores or raters are all likely to lead to more consistent results. Number 6. Add more scorers, raters of performance. If two people score an assessment and the item scores are compared, errors can easily be identified and dealt with. If two scorers or raters score a performance, their disagreements can be settled through a third opinion. The outcome is much more likely to be fair reflection of the assessor's abilities. Number 7. Assess learners with a wide range of ability. It is much easier to tell the difference between a carving made by an expert master craftsman and one made by a beginner than to choose between two pieces made by experts. In the same way, it is relatively easy to build an assessment that reliably distinguish between very high and very low ability language user. If all the assessors are not truly the same level, estimated of reliability are likely to be lower. Task 4.6. Here are 3 situations. What problems might each cause for the reliability of the assessment results? How could you change things to increase reliability in each case? Are there any reasons why changes that improve reliability might not be good for the overall quality of each assessment? Number 1 is students are assessed on a research project they carry out outside school. The teacher lets students choose a topic that interests them. They have to find information about the topic in the foreign language and write a report. Some students come to school from a village outside the city and have a long bus journey each day. Other students live in the city close by the school. There is a good library service at the school with internet access. The teacher scores the project as A. Excellent, B. Good, C. Satisfactory, or D. Fail. Number 2. Teachers in a foreign language department develop a new test of listening which counts 25% of the final course grade. The test involves listening to a conversation between a guest and a hotel receptionist and filling in a form with the guest's personal details. Because there is only one form of the test, the teachers don't feel they need to produce a specification, guidelines, or other extra material, just a recording and question paper. Each teacher gives the test in class, scores the responses out of 12 points, and reports the scores to the school. During an important 1-hour writing test, one of the assessors faints and falls to the floor, knocking over his chair as he fails. The invigilators rush over and manage to help him out the test room. He sits outside with one of the invigilators and soon feels better. After around 20 minutes, he is able to return and complete the test. When the other assessors have left the room, he is allowed an extra 20 minutes to complete his work. The test papers are scored and results reported in the usual way. Validity. It is important for all kinds of language assessment to be reliable. A learner told by one teacher that she had clear native-like pronunciation would feel confused and miss accent made her speech almost unintelligible and recommended remedial training. An employer who recruited 2 trainees with identical score on an interview test would lose confidence in the test if one trainee arriving for work seemed to be fluent in the language and the other incapable of connected speech. However, consistency of results is not a guarantee of their quality. Experience tells us that it is possible to be consistently wrong. Defining validity. Validity is often seen as the essential quality of a good assessment. According to the classic definition cited in language testing handbooks such as Davis 1990, Haggis 2003, and Brown 2005, a test can be considered valid when it's really measured what it purports to measure. McCall 1922 went on to explain that ensuring the validity of a test involves securing a close correspondence between test results and practical life. Test results are more comparable to life results that more nearly the test process approaches the character of life process. If the steps that the assessee has to go through to obtain a high score on the test closely match the processes that language users go through when carrying out tests in real life, the assessment accurately represents relevant features of the assessor's knowledge, skills, or abilities, and so must be valid. The connection between test and real-life abilities and then identified by McCall remains central in modern ideas about validity. But his definition is now seen to be too limited and somewhat misleading. A more current and comprehensive definition is given in 1999, Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing. Validity refers to the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretation of test scores entailed by proposed uses of tests. American Educational Research Association. The process of collecting evidence of the validity of inferences based on assessment results is known as validation. Many different approaches can be taken to validation, but the approach adopted should be shed light on the conclusion what we wish to make about learners when using the assessment, ensuring that evidence and theory will support the interpretation of a test score entailed by proposed uses of tests must begin at the design phase. When designing an assessment, we have seen that the first step should be to define and agree on what knowledge, skills, or abilities are to be assessed in order to inform decisions about the assessors. The point has already been made that knowledge, skill, and abilities cannot be directly observed and measured in the same way as a physical characteristic such as height or weight. However, it is generally assumed that they can be described either as attributes of the individual human mind or as a product of human societies, and that they are variable. Some people have more of these attributes and others have less. For the purposes of assessment, abstract conceptions of this kind are known as a psychological construct. If we make claims such as your grandmother is the best cook in the neighborhood, we are implying that she possesses more of some underlying capacity or traits of cooking ability than the rest of us. But what exactly do we mean by cooking ability? Is my understanding of the concept of the same as yours? How could I prove the truth of the claim that your grandmother is the best? The two threats to validity. Miss Sick, 1989, argued that there are two basic threats to the validity of score interpretation. These are construct irrelevance elements are involved in an assessment that are not connected to the knowledge, skills, or abilities we intend to measure, and construct underrepresentation, failure to include elements on an assessment that are relevant to the knowledge, skills, or abilities we intend to measure. Construct irrelevance. During the 19th century, a German doctor named Franz Joseph Gale found a branch of science known as phrenology. He believed that it was possible to measure a person's mental abilities, including their capacity for learning languages, by measuring the shape of their skulls. Just as lifting heavy weights causes people's muscles to increase in size, Gale believed that someone with a gift for languages would have a well-developed language faculty in their brain. This would cause a certain region of their skull to bulge. A phrenologist's language aptitude assessment would involve making careful and no doubt very reliable measurement of the shape of the learner's head. Disappointingly, Gale's theory proved to be mistaken. Skull shape is not connected to the language ability. The phrenologist's language aptitude test would therefore be entirely construct irrelevant. The measurement would not really have any association with the ability supposed content validity. If we are going to use the results from an assessment, we should be satisfied that performance of the assessment really required the targeted knowledge, skill, or abilities, and that she balanced made between components in the assessment will provide a sound basis for the specific decisions that will be made about the assessments. Ideally, the material included in an assessment should represent the full range of the knowledge, skills, or abilities that the assessment is intended to cover. Unfortunately, life is not usually that simple. It really is not possible for any assessment to cover the full range of content that it might be desirable to assess. Limitations on the time available and on the methods that is feasible to use to administer and score the assessment. There will always be construct underrepresentation. These limitations suggest that developers can generally only include a very small fraction of the range of knowledge, skills, and abilities that they are interested in. Perhaps the best they can hope for, as Hags 2003 suggested, is to sample widely and unpredictably to assess as a wide a range of content as possible, and to do this is an unpredictable way so that learners and teachers cannot foresee what is likely to be assessed and then concentrate on learning only that relatively narrow area of content. Regrettably, something widely and unpredictably may have a negative effect on reliability, as assessors taking different forms of assessment always involves balancing consideration and making difficult choices, bearing in mind practical limits on how much material can or should be assessed. Thus, should be carefully chosen to ensure that a sufficient range in included indications of how far this has been achieved serve as evidence for content validity. The key source of content validity evidence are reviews of the assessment material. Content validation can and should be carried out before an assessment is put into operation through evaluation of the design statement and specifications. Experts in the knowledge, skill, or abilities being assessed may be consulted on the content of the assessment. They evaluate how adequately they believe the items assess the intended knowledge, skills, or abilities, and how to comprehensively they cover these. Once the assessments becomes operational, routine checks need to be made to ensure that the forms of the assessment have adequate content validity. Thus, the material assess the intended construct and reflect the specifications. Another form of the validity often mentioned in language assessment handbooks is face validity. This is very similar to content validity, but the judgments are made by non-express, assesses parents, employers. The distinction between the two therefore rests on the potentially controversial issue of who should be recognized as an expert judge. Members of the stakeholders groups listed above are not recognized by measurements specialists as experts will inform insights into linguistic theory. This means that face validity is not regarded as a genuine source of validity evidence. In practice, the reaction of the stakeholders certainly will have to be taken into account, if only a system constraints back 2009 that restrict the designer's freedom of choice. If learners, employers, and others do not believe that an assessment is credible, that it provides useful information, they may fail to take it seriously or reject it altogether. See Alderson et al. 1995. Both congruent and predictive validity have some serious limitations. There are practical difficulties for classroom teachers, in particular in gaining access to suitable criterion measures. Concurrent validation is dependent on the quality of the criterion measure. Scores on different assessments may be very similar, suggesting that the both are measuring the same thing, but this is no guarantee that they are both measuring the right thing. New assessments are often intended to measure rather different knowledge, skill, or abilities than the old assessment, so very close matches are not really desirable. If the level of arrangement is low, it is unclear whether it is the new assessment of the criterion measure that better captures the learner's abilities. With predictive validation, the trouble is that people scoring below a certain level do not often get admitted to the course or accepted for the job to which the assessment relates. Although people achieving passing grades may perform well, there is no evidence about those who failed. Perhaps they would have performed just as well or better given the chance. Once accepted for a course or job, people may perform poorly for the reason unconnected to their language abilities, health, finances, family problems, and so on. It is often just not possible to track the performance of learners after they have left the school. These difficulties mean that relationships between assessment results and later performance are usually found to be very weak. Construct validity. It is a fundamental requirement for the effective operation of any assessment system that everybody involved interpreting assessment results shows at least a basic understanding of the construct or constructs involved. It could be disastrous if a test developer built a test intended to establish whether or not a learner has the language skill necessary to hold a conversation about everyday topics such as entertainment and travel, but an employer interprets the results to mean that the learner is ready to work in a field where knowledge of a specialist language is essential, as a nurse, for example, participating in surgical operation, or as an air traffic controller with responsibility for the safety of passengers. Evidence for the validity of the content of an assessment and for its relationship to creation measure can both help to inform an overall judgment about how well an assessor's performance truly reflects their knowledge, skills, or abilities, and whether the information provided by the assessment is relevant and adequate to support the intended decision. Ultimately, this is evidence that the theory underpinning the assessment, the construct, provides a sound basis for that decision. Construct validity is therefore seen as embracing all forms of validity evidence. One well-established approach to collecting construct validation evidence is the multi-trait, multi-method approach. Campbell and Christie, 1959. The validator seeks to discover whether results from the assessment under investigation, assessment X, are similar to results on other assessment. Assessment Y that uses different task types but addresses the same knowledge, skills, or abilities. This is a variation on congruent validity, sometimes called convergent validity. At the same time, results on other assessment that use the same task types as assessment X but assess different knowledge, skill, or abilities should rank the assessors in a different order. Divergent validity, an application of the multi-trait, multi-method approach in language test validation, is the Bachman et al. 1995 comparison between the Cambridge First Certificate in English (FCE) and the Test of English as a Foreign Language (TOEFL). Over recent years, complementing statistical approaches such as multi-trait, multi-method, there has been increasing interest in other ways to explore whether the knowledge, skills, or abilities that are involved when assessors tackle assessment tasks are the knowledge, skill, or abilities intended by the developers. This has been called cognitive validity. Baxter and Glasser, 1998, Weir, 2005. One approach to cognitive validation is to ask the assessors about how they carry out tasks. This is often done using verbal protocol methods that involve assessors reporting on how they found a correct answer or how they decided on the content and structure of an essay. See for the example Weir et al. 2012. Task 4.8, because it is a skill identified with the fluent readers, it is pretty common for tests of reading comprehension to include items that involve guessing and meaning a word based on the context. Here is an example from an assessment of English reading skills for high school students of biology. What is the meaning of underlined word in this sentence? The rotiferous ciliated trochal, this in use both for locomotion and feeding. What does the word trochal mean? Can you find the answer by looking at the context of the other words in the sentence? Here are 4 answer options. Do they help you to find answer? What effect do they have on you choose? A. With multiple functions. B. Located on the other side. C. Broad and flat. D. Resembling a wheel. How would you establish the content validity of the item? How about its cognitive validity? It is also possible to observe how assessors perform by analyzing their behavior. Insights have been gained into how readers respond to the comprehension questions by recording their eye movements and tracking where they direct their attention while they read. Polson 2, or by recording each keystroke when they compose their responses to assessment tasks on a computer. Chan, 2012. Task 4.9. An assessment of speaking skills is intended to show, among other things, how well learners are able to make excuses. Here is a task given to assessee. You arrange to meet your friend but you are late. What do you say to her? Do you think this task will involve assessors in making excuses? Do you think the assessee will use the same language that she would use outside the classroom? How would you judge whether the assessee had responded appropriately? How would you score the response if the assessee did not make an excuse? Interpretive arguments assessing the evidence. McNamara, 2000, explains that the process of validation is now often likened to a trial in a law court. In trials in many countries, lawyers for each side in the case present a version of events, and the judge or jury members make a decision about which seems more plausible. Similarly, the users of assessment results, or those holding them to account, need to weigh up the evidence and judge whether an assessment provides a suitable basis for their decisions. Unlike in a court of law, however, the cause is never considered closed. More arguments can always be made and new evidence sought. There is always scope to improve the quality of the assessment. The process of weighing evidence can be conceived as a series of what Kane et al. 1999 call inferential bridges, links in a chain of argument connecting test performance with practical life, and so justifying or challenging the use of the assessment as a means of gathering evidence to support a decision. The steps or bridges in the interpretive assessment use argument, Bachman and Palmer 2010, are set out in Figure 4.3 and Table 4.3 as a series of claims that a test user would want to able to make about an assessee on the basis of performance on the assessments. Ranged against these claims are credible alternative explanations for the results or potential rebuttals of the claims. Test users and validators need to explore different explanations for an assessee's performance, including both those explanations that support the intended interpretation and those that do not. Performance on the assessment. Number 1, evaluation. Is the result a fair reflection of the assessee's performance? Number 2, generalization. Would similar results be obtained with different tasks or raters? Number 3, explanation. Does the assessment reflect a coherent theory of language? Number 4, utilization. Are the abilities measured by the assessment relevant to the decision being made about the assessee? Figure 4.3, inferential bridges in the interpretation of assessment results. Source based on the Kane et al. 1999. Assessments as maps. As tools for communicating about the world around us, assessments have been compared to maps. Henning 1987. Like maps, different approaches and formats for assessment are suited to different purposes and must be carefully chosen. A map that is very helpful for one purpose may be quite useless for another, and an expensive detailed map is not always the one that best suits our needs. Practical maps often have to be quite limited in size. Designers must be selective in choosing which features to display so that the paper of the screen will not be overcrowded and unreadable. Clear presentation of one set of features such as roads may involve taking away other features such as hills and forests. Walking maps provide a lot of detail, but can cover only a small area. This may make it easier to follow a walking route, but more difficult to locate places of interest. Useful transport maps showing bus or train routes assessment can be life-changing. They are used in deciding who should have access to important opportunities in areas such as immigration, further education, and employment. They can serve as relatively straightforward gateways, new prospects for some people, and stand as impenetrable walls, keeping others excluded. Assessment promise a fairer way of making decisions than the systems of patronage and nepotism that they replace, but their apparent neutrality can mask continuing injustice. The content, format, and administration of assessment can work systematically in favor of one group of assessors and against another. The people who administer assessment and make decisions based on assessment results generally have an official status that gives them power over the assessors, and it may not be easy to hold them to account. If an assessment, Figure 4.4 sets out how washback is believed to come about. First, the way in which learners respond to an assessment has a good deal to do with the design of the assessment and the content that it covers. In preparing for an assessment, teachers and learners would naturally be expected to focus on the knowledge, skill, or abilities that they believe the assessment deals with and give less attention to those that do not seem to be included. In a well-designed instructional program, consideration is given to the relationship between what learners are intended to learn, the focal construct in Figure 4.4, and the content of the assessment. The overlap shown in Figure 4.4 is closely linked to face validity. See about it as it reflects the point of view of the teachers and learners preparing for the test, their perception of what is being assessed. This influences the washback direction, which may be seen as positive or negative. If an assessment validly measures the range of abilities that learners need to acquire, teachers should be encouraged to teach towards that assessment, because learning for the assessment will also mean learning for life beyond the test. The direction of washback will be positive. If the assessment appears to cover only a limited amount of content, construct under representation, or if it assesses abilities that are not included on the planned curriculum, construct a relevance, teacher may stop teaching important aspects of that curriculum in order to concentrate on the features that they believe are assessed. The direction of washback will be negative. Historically, arguments about washback have been most intense when there have been disagreements about nature of language ability and effective language teaching. Groups arguing for a radical new approach come into conflict with assessments that are based on the established old approach. A new curriculum introduces a focus on speaking skills, for example, but the old test is still used and it does not include a component assessing speaking. Teachers feel under pressure from students and their parents to get good results on the test and so focus on the skills that are tested rather than on the speaking skills. Mandated a new curriculum. The solution, it has been argued, would be to bring in a new test that does not include a speaking component. This would encourage teachers to teach according to the new approach. More recently, research has highlighted a serious flaw in this line of argument. Teacher and learner behavior are not as easy to manipulate as it suggests. First, people may not be fully aware of the changes made to the test or its implication for teaching and learning. Second, they may not be sympathetic to the changes and may resist them. A traditional teacher may not believe that it is possible or desirable to teach speaking skill and may avoid making any changes to her practices. Her colleagues may want to teach speaking but lack confidence in their own speaking abilities or lack the training to manage speaking activities in the classroom. The research into washback suggests that teachers tend to pay close attention to the format of a test. The research into washback suggests that the teachers tend to pay close attention to the format of a test rather than considering the underlying construct, the knowledge, skill, or abilities targeted by the assessment. Just focusing on practice with the test format might not really help test takers to improve in the abilities being assessed. Green 2007, a new spoken interview assessment based on personal information intended to assess impromptu conversation skills might, in practice, encourage memorization or formulaic exchanges or short memorized speeches on obscure topics, even though this may be of rather limited value outside or even inside the examination room. Shohami et al. 1996, not every learner has the same access to preparation resources. Textbooks, sample papers, computers, and tutors individuals have their own ideas about that might be effective ways of learning and of achieving success. They may or may not be pursued by advice from testing organizations, teachers, textbook writers, and others. Washback will be more powerful where all of these stakeholders in the educational system share the same belief about effective test preparation work together to achieve it. In practice, washback tends to be highly variable. Washback variability in Figure 4.4. Within a single class, one learner may radically change her language learning behaviors to prepare for a test, while another makes no change at all to his. The variability in the way that people respond to an assessment is linked to their perception of the importance and the level of challenge that the assessment represents. These factors influence the washback intensity that each individual experiences. Washback will not be intense. Learners are not likely to change the way in which they learn in order to prepare for the assessment. If doing well does not really matter to them, this could be because they think success is likely to be embracingly easy, or on the other hand, because they think they stand no chance of getting a good score. Washback is really like to be more intense if learners do value success and think that achieving it is challenging but realistic. In these circumstances, learners are likely to whatever they can do prepare for the assessment. They might increase the amount of studying that they do, or they might be prepared to change their study methods. To limit the intensity of the washback from any single assessment so that no one assessment comes to dominate teaching and learning, it may be wise for test users to base decisions on as wide a range of evidence as possible and make it very clear to the test takers that this their policy. The strategy for improving validity advocated by Hodge 2003 of sampling widely and unpredictably is also relevant to washback, as it means that learners and teachers cannot foresee what is likely to be assessed and so concentrate their efforts on learning only the relatively narrow area of content. All assessments have consequences for at least one person. The impact is unlikely to be really beneficial unless the assessment is practical, reliable, and valid. If the information gained from an assessment is misleading, it is likely that many of the consequences flowing from it be damaging. That is not to say beneficial consequences will automatically come from good assessment. Potential benefits will only be fully released if all participants in the educational system work together. Feedback. While washback from tests can have a powerful effect on the behavior of teachers and learners, the consequences of formative classroom-based procedures are more immediate and potentially more far-reaching. Such assessment must, of course, have practicality, reliability, and validity. The scorers and the users, usually the teachers and learners themselves, need a clear and accurate picture of what it is that learners are or not able to do. This will not be possible unless the task and questioning techniques they use are of good quality. However, understanding something about a learner's knowledge, skills, or abilities, correctly inferring what they cannot or cannot do, is not enough to be useful. The insights obtained through formative assessment procedures must inform effective action. The main priority of formative assessment is therefore the provision of feedback and encourages and promotes learning. Stogart 2006. Feedback is a metaphor based on systems engineering. It involves using information about the current state of a system to regulate and make adjustments to that system. The ancient technology of water clocks, see Figure 4.5, exploits the concept. Water passes through a gap of a fixed size as a constant rate, and this fact can be used to tell the time. If water drips through a hole in the bottom of one bowl into a second bowl, the amount of water collected there shows how much time has passed. However, if the level of water in the top bowl goes up or down, the drips will flow at different speeds. The clock will become inaccurate for the clock to work well. The water in the top bowl must be kept at the constant level. One way to solve the problem would be to employ a person to watch the system and add water when needed. That would be very insufficient. Instead, our ancestors worked out an ingenious alternative. They put a float into the top bowl. If the top bowl is filled with water, the float rises and blocks the inlet pipe. As the water level falls because of the dripping water, the float sinks down and the inlet pipe is unblocked, letting water through to fill the boat. In this way, the water level is held constant. The system regulates itself because information about the current state of the system is used. Feedback to change the state of the system is the system to open or close the inlet pipe as necessary. In a similar way, accurate information about current performance in the classroom obtained through assessment can be feedback to the teacher and learners. If learners is found to be proceeding smoothly, the class carries on a plan. If the assessment reveals that all is not going well, carefully chosen feedback can be used to trigger modification that will keep learning moving forward efficiently. Repeating, practicing, or revising if necessary. Exploring and extending where opportunities arise. Less time is wasted because learners are not left to struggle with material they do not understand and are not held up by studying material that is already known. If no information is obtained or if the information is of poor quality, feedback cannot be effective. The information that teachers look for and the amount and kinds of feedback they can offer to their students to help them improve their performance will depend in the large measure on their beliefs about language learning, what they accept as evidence that learning has occurred, and what they believe are the steps required to help students to make progress. Leong 2010, the validity of a formative assessment approach is therefore closely tied to the theories of learning that support it. William 2011 provided compelling evidence for the power of well-conceived feedback given to learners of all ages to improve learning generally and to narrow the performance gap between the higher achieving and lower achieving learners. However, he also cautioned that simply providing feedback gives to guarantee that beneficial consequences will follow and observe that some forms of feedback have actually been found to be counterproductive. The failure of much of the feedback given by teachers to foster better learning may have a variety of causes. Wiggins 1998 suggested that students can often find the feedback they are given uninformative. It leaves them feeling they know that they are close to or from the goal, but they don't know what or where the goal is. Wiggins 1998, it does not convey to the learners what a better performance would look like or what they need to change in their current performance to improve it. On the other hand, when potentially useful feedback is provided, it is often ignored by learners because it is provided at the wrong time. After the work has been completed, it has been observed that as soon as grades are awarded, many learners tend to ignore the teacher's comments and so fail to benefit from the feedback they provide. Table 4.4 lays out some of the features that have been found to characterize more and less effective feedback strategies. Effective feedback is given at the point when it can be used by learners. This means that learners should be given opportunities to improve their performance on the basis of the feedback. Feedback is more likely to promote learning if the learners are challenged to think about ways in which their work has been successful and communicating their intended message. In ways in which it has not been successful, they should then be able to use the insights gained through feedback to try again or to revise what they have produced. This is not reason why advocates assessment for learning suggests that the awards or grades, which signals that a piece of work is finished, should be delayed for as long as possible and be often modification through remedial work. Another reason is that instead of encouraging greater effort, consistently low grades can cause students to feel that they are poor learners and lose motivation, while consistently high grades can encourage complacency and also lead to reduction of effort. William 2011. Namara 2012 term person reference feedback phrase on criticism of learners is not considered particularly valuable because it is uninformative about how performance should be modified to make it better. It is much more helpful to To offer task reference feedback that is concerned with the qualities of the learner's work. Brevity is favored. One or two well-chosen observations will be more likely to bring about productive reflection than a lengthy essay or lecture from the teacher on everything that could be improved. Feedback is more effective and the overall system of assessment more coherent if it can be demonstrated to relate to learning goals. In other words, it should be explanatory and corrective, making it as clear as possible to the learner how his or her work satisfies or fails to satisfy the criteria for competent performance and how it could be improved. Hill and McNamara 2012 feedback based on checklists or rating scales provided that learners understand this is therefore more useful than simple grades or scores. Models of successful performance can also help learners to notice what is successful and unsuccessful about their own. Although it should be made clear that models are not intended for direct imitation, can learn how to interpret the criteria and use them to assess the work of other learners and eventually to assess their own work. Models of successful performance can also help learners to notice what is successful and unsuccessful about their own, although it should be made clear that models are not intended for direct imitation, in that learners will be better placed to benefit from feedback if they can learn how to interpret the criteria and use them to assess the work of other learners and eventually to assess their own work. Teachers as well as learners can benefit from receiving feedback. If a class is struggling to understand a new concept, the teacher needs to know this so that he or she can provide more scaffolding support that helps the learner to understand how to complete a task or find another way to convey the ideas. When learners are already familiar with whatever is being taught, the teacher may be able to move quickly through the unit or bring in some more challenging material. If such issues are only picked up during an end-of-unit test, it may be too late to take action. Frequent informal assessment activities keep teachers in touch with how well learners are able to assimilate new information and help highlight where any difficulties lie. Summary: the right tool for the job. As tools, language assessment are closer in nature to maps than to tape measures, although they may differ in their precision and in the units they employ. All tape measures are designed to measure length. In contrast, maps represent and highlight different aspects of a multidimensional world according to the needs of the user. Like maps, language assessment should not all measure and represent the same things. The choice of assessment techniques should reflect the kinds of decisions that users wish to make and the kinds of consequences that they hope will follow. The four-quality framework of practicality, reliability, validity, and beneficial consequences inform design and helps users to apply the price principles. See Module 3, Taking Full Account of the Intended Purpose of Assessment. Just as there is no perfect map, no assessment can fully satisfy all four essential qualities. Ultimately, user must be satisfied that an assessment is a justified use of resources because it is a better basis for decisions and leads for better consequences than the alternatives. At the same time, everyone involved should strive to improve on current practice. That's all and thank you.